All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Don't get upset if I pass out in the middle of recording this video. All right, we're still on the future in perspective, page 1231. All right. To the West, in spite of all its aberrations, the greatest sin, from Lucifer to Hitler, has been pride, especially in the form of intellectual arrogance, and the greatest virtue has been humility, especially in the intellectual form, which concedes that opinions are always subject to modification by new experiences, new evidence, and the opinions of our fellow men. These procedures that I have identified as Western and have illustrated from the rather unpromising field of religion are to be found in all aspects of Western life. The most triumphant of these aspects is science, whose method is a perfect example of the Western tradition. The scientist goes eagerly to work each day because he has the humility to know that he does not have any final answers and must work to modify and improve the answers he has. He publishes his opinions and research reports or exposes these in scientific gatherings so that they may be subjected to the criticism of his colleagues and thus gradually play a role in formulating the constantly unfolding consensus that is science. That is, what science is, a consensus unfolding in time by a cooperative effort in which each works diligently seeking the truth and submits his work to the discussion and critique of his fellows to make a new, slightly improved, temporary consensus. Because this is the tradition of the West is liberal. Most historians see liberalism as a political outlook and practice found in the 19th century. But 19th century liberalism was simply a temporary organizational manifestation of what has always been the underlying Western outlook. That organizational manifestation is now largely dead, killed as much by the 20th century liberals as by the conservatives or reactionaries. It was killed because liberals took applications of that manifestation of the Western outlook and made these applications rigid, ultimate, and inflexible goals. The liberal of 1880 was anti-clerical, anti-militarist, and anti-state because these were, to his immediate experience, authoritarian forces that sought to prevent the operation of the Western way. The same liberal was for freedom of assembly, of speech, and of the press because these were necessary to form the consensus that is so much a part of the Western process of operation. But by 1900 or so, these dislikes and likes became ends in themselves. The liberal was prepared to force people to associate with those they could not bear in the name of freedom of assembly, or he was, in the name of freedom of speech, prepared to force people to listen. His anti-clericalism became an effort to prevent people from getting religion, and his anti-militarism took the form of opposing funds for legitimate defense. Most amazing, his earlier opposition to the use of private economic power to restrict individual freedoms took the form of an effort to increase the authority of the state against private economic power and wealth in themselves. Thus, the liberal of 1880 and the liberal of 1940 had reversed themselves on the rule and power of the state, the earlier seeking to curtail it, the latter seeking to increase it. Sounds about right. In the process, the upholder of the former liberal ideas that the power of the state should be curtailed came to be called a conservative. This simply added to the intellectual confusion of the mid-20th century, which arose from the irrational activist reluctance to define any terms, a distinction that has now penetrated deeply into all intellectual and academic life. What is a woman? We can't define what a woman is. In this connection, we might say that the whole recent controversy between conservatism and liberalism is utterly wrong-headed and ignorant. Since the true role of conservatism must be to conserve the tradition of our society, and since that tradition is a liberal tradition, the two should be closely allied in their aim at common goals. So long as liberals and conservatives have as their primary goal to defend interest and to belabor each other for partisan reasons, they cannot do this. When they decide to look at the realities beneath the controversies, they might begin with a little book that appeared many years ago, 1902, from the hand of a member of the chief family in the English Conservative Party over the past century. The book is Conservatism by Lord Hugh Cecil. This volume defines conservatism very much as I have defined liberalism and the outlook of the West as tentative, flexible, undogmatic, communal, and moderate. Its fundamental assumption is that men are imperfect creatures, will probably get further by working together than by blind opposition, and that, since undoubtedly each is wrong to some extent, any extreme or drastic action is inadvisable. Conservatism of this type was, indeed, closer to what I have called liberalism than the liberals of the 1880s were. Since the conservatives of this type were perfectly willing to use the church or the army or the state to carry out their moderate and tentative projects, and were prepared to use the state to curtail arbitrary private economic power, which the liberals of the day were unwilling to do, since they embraced a doctrinaire belief in the limitation of state power. All this is of significance because it is concerned with the fact that there is an age-old Western tradition, much battered and destroyed in recent generations, that has sent up new, living shoots of vigorous growth since 1945. These new shoots have appeared even in those areas where the orthodox 19th century liberals looked to find only enemies, in the church and in the armed forces. The operation of what I have called the liberal tradition of the West is evident in all religious thought of recent years, even in that of Roman Catholicism. It is almost equally evident in military life, where the practice of consulting diverse and even outside opinion to reach tentative decisions is increasingly obvious. Recently, I attended a conference of the United States Navy Special Projects Office where a diverse group tried to reach some consensus about the form of naval weapons systems 12 years in the future. The agenda, as set up for 7 weeks, provided for 33 successive approximations narrowing in on the desired consensus. This was listed on the agenda as final approximation and crystallization of dissent. The recognition that the final goal was still approximate and the equal role provided for disagreement within consensus shows clearly how the tradition of the West operates today within the armed forces of the West. This return to the tradition of the West is evident in many aspects of life beyond those mentioned here. Strangely enough, the return of which we speak is much more evident in the United States than it is in Europe, and accordingly, some of the most significant examples of it will be mentioned in the following section, which is concerned with the United States. The reason for this, apparently, is that Europeans, after their very difficult experiences of depression and war, are now overly eager for the mundane benefits made possible by advancing technology and are, as a result, increasingly selfish and materialistic, while Americans, having tasted the flesh pots of affluence, are increasingly unselfish, community conscious, and non material in their attitudes. A careful look, however, will show that the movement is present on both sides of the Atlantic and appears perhaps most obviously in a growing concern with one's fellow men, a kind of practical Christianity, and a spreading evidence of charity and love in the old Christian meaning of these terms. There seems to be, especially among the younger generation, a growing emphasis on fellowship and interpersonal relationships, and an increasing skepticism towards abstract power, high blown slogans, old war cries, and authority. There is a reaching out to one another, seeking to understand, to help, to comfort. There is a growing tolerance of differences, an amused attitude of live and let live, and, above all, there is an avid discussion of values and priorities that include more spiritual items than a generation ago. There is an almost universal rejection of authority, of rigid formulas, and of final or total answers. In a word, there is a fumbling effort to rediscover the tradition of the West by a generation that has been largely cut off from that tradition. We have said that this tradition is one of inclusive diversity, in which one of the chief problems is how elements that seem discordant but are recognized as real and necessary may be fitted together. The solution to this problem, which rests in the tradition itself, is to be found in the idea of hierarchy. Diverse elements are discordant only because they are out of place. Once the proper arrangement is found, discord is replaced by concord. Once, long ago, a young person said to me, "Dirt is only misplaced matter," a typical Western attitude. Today, young persons spend increasing time in argument and thought on how diverse things, all of which seem necessary, can be arranged in a hierarchy of importance or priority: military service, preparation for a vocation, love and marriage, personal development, desire to help others. All these compete for energy, time, and attention. In what order should they be arranged? This is quite different from the successful young man of yesteryear who had one clearly perceived goal: to prepare for a career in money making. The road to that career was marked by materialism, selfishness, and pride, all attitudes of low favor in the outlook of the West, not because they are absolutely wrong, but because they indicate a failure to see the place of things in the general structure of the universe. Even pride, either in Lucifer or in Somus Foresight, is a failure to realize one's own position in the whole picture. And today, especially in America, increasing numbers of people are trying to see the whole picture. And then when they see the whole picture, they realize that it's satanic, pedophile, Jewish guys running everything behind the scenes. That's the full picture. The United States and the middle class crisis. The character of any society is determined less by what it is actually like than by the picture it has of itself or of what it aspires to be. From this point of view, American society of the 1920s was largely middle class. Its values and aspirations were middle class. The power or influence within it was in the hands of middle class people. On the whole, this was regarded as proper, except by iconoclastic writers who gained fortune and reputation by simply satirizing or criticizing middle class customs. To be sure, Even the most vigorous defenders of bourgeois America did not pretend that all Americans were middle class. Only the more important ones were. But they did see the country as organized in middle class terms, and they looked forward to a not remote future in which everyone would be middle class except for a small, shiftless minority of no importance. To these defenders, and probably also to the shiftless minority, American society was regarded as a ladder of opportunity up which anyone could work his way, on rungs of increased affluence, to the supreme position of wealth and power near the top. Wealth, power, prestige, and respect were all obtained by the same standard, by kidnapping and doing satanic worship with children. No, okay. Based on money. This, in turn, was based on pervasive emotional insecurity that sought relief in the ownership and control of material possessions. The basis for this may be seen most clearly in the origins of this bourgeois middle class. 1,000 years ago, Europe had a two-class society in which a small upper class of nobles and upper clergy were supported by a great mass of peasants. The nobles defended this world, and the clergy opened the way to the next world, while the peasants provided the food and other material needs for the whole society. All three had security in their social relationships, and they occupied positions of social status that satisfied their psychic needs for companionship, economic security, and a foreseeable future and purpose of their efforts. Yeah, because back then a peasant could still get a wife. Members of both classes had little anxiety about loss of these things by any likely outcome of events, and all thus had emotional security. In the course of the medieval period, chiefly in the 12th and 13th centuries, this simple two-class society was modified by the intrusion of a small but distinctly different new class between them. Because this new class was between, we call it middle class, just as we call it bourgeois, after bourg meaning town, from the fact that it resided in towns, a new kind of social aggregate. The two older, established classes were almost completely rural and intimately associated with the land, economically, socially, and spiritually. The permanence of the land and the intimate connection of the land with the most basic of human needs, especially food, amplified the emotional security associated with the older classes. The new middle class of bourgeois who grew up between the two older classes had none of these things. They were commercial peoples concerned with exchange of goods, mostly luxury goods, in a society where all their prospective customers already had the basic necessities of life provided by their status. The new middle class had no status in a society based on status. They had no security or permanence in a society that placed the highest value on these qualities. They had no law, since medieval law was largely past customs, and their activities were not customary ones. In a society that highly valued law, the flow of the necessities of life, notably food, to the new town dwellers was precarious, so that some of their earliest and most emphatic actions were taken to ensure the flow of such goods from the surrounding country to the town. All the things the bourgeois did were new things. All were precarious and insecure, and their whole lives were lived without the status, permanence, and security the society of the day most highly valued. The risks and rewards of commercial enterprise, well reflected in the fluctuating fortunes of figures such as Antonio in The Merchant of Venice, were extreme. A single venture could ruin a merchant or make him rich. This insecurity was increased by the fact that the prevalent religion of the day disapproved of what he was doing, seeking profits or taking interest, and could see no way of providing religious services to town dwellers because of the intimate association of the e- oh my God, ecclesiastical ecclesiastical system with the existing arrangements of rural landholding. For these and other reasons, psychic insecurities became the keynote of the middle class outlook. It still is. The only remedy for this insecurity of the middle class seemed to be the accumulation of more possessions that could be a demonstration to the world of the individual's importance and power. In this way, for the middle class, the general goal of medieval man to seek future salvation in the hereafter was secularized to an effort to seek future security in this world by acquisition of wealth and its accompanying power and social prestige. But the social prestige from wealth was most available among fellow bourgeois rather than among nobles or peasants. Thus, the opinions of one's fellow bourgeois, by wealth and by conformity to bourgeois values, became the motivating drives of the middle class, creating what has been called the acquisitive society. In that society, prudence, discretion, conformity, moderation, except in acquisition, decorum, frugality became the marks of a sound man. Credit became more important than intrinsic personal qualities, and credit was based on the appearance of things, especially the appearances of the external material accessories of life. The facts of a man's personal qualities, such as kindness, affection, thoughtfulness, generosity, personal insight, and such, were increasingly irrelevant or even adverse to the middle class evaluation of man. Instead, the middle class evaluation rested rather on non personal attributes and on external accessories. Where personal qualities were admired, they were those that contributed to acquisition, often qualities opposed to the established values of the Christian outlook, such as love, charity, generosity, gentleness, or unselfishness. These middle class qualities included decisiveness, selfishness, impersonality, ruthless energy, and insatiable ambition. As the middle classes and their commercialization of all human relationships spread through Western society in the centuries from the 12th to the 20th, they largely modified and to some extent reversed the values of Western society earlier. In some cases, the old values, such as future preference or self discipline, remained but were redirected. Future preference ceased to be transcendental in its aim and became secularized. Self discipline ceased to seek spirituality by restraining sensuality and instead sought material acquisition. In general, the new middle class outlook had a considerable religious basis, but it was the religion of the medieval heresies and of Puritanism rather than the religion of Roman Christianity. This complex outlook that we call middle class or bourgeois is, of course, the chief basis of our world today. Western society is the richest and most powerful society that has ever existed, largely because it has been impelled forward along these lines beyond the rational degree of beyond the rational degree necessary to satisfy human needs by the irrational drive for achievement in terms of material ambitions. To be sure, Western society always had other kinds of people, and the majority of the people in Western society probably had other outlooks and values, but it was middle class agency that pushed modern developments in the direction they took. There were always in our society dreamers and truth seekers and tinkerers. They, as poets, scientists, and engineers, thought up innovations which the middle classes adopted and exploited if they seemed likely to be profit producing. Middle class self discipline and future preferences provided the savings and investment without which any innovation, no matter how appealing in theory, would be set aside and neglected. But the innovations that could attract middle class approval and exploitation were the ones that made our world today so different from the world of our grandparents and ancestors. This middle class character was imposed most strongly on the United States. In order to identify it and to discuss a very complex pattern of outlooks and values, we shall try to summarize it. At its basis is psychic insecurity founded on the lack of secure social status. The cure for such insecurity became insatiable material acquisition. From this flowed a large number of attributes, of which we shall list only 5: future preference, self discipline, social conformity, infinitely expandable material demand, and a general emphasis on externalized, impersonal values. Those who have this outlook are middle class. Those who lack it are something else. Thus, middle class status is a matter of outlook and not a matter of occupation or status. There can be middle class clergy or teachers or scientists. Indeed, in the United States, most of these 3 groups are middle class, although their theoretical devotion to truth rather than to profit, or to others rather than to self, might seem to imply that they should not be middle class. And indeed, they should not be, for the urge to seek truth or to help others are not really compatible with the middle class values. But in our culture, the latter have been so influential and pervasive, and the economic power of middle class leaders has been so great that many people whose occupations, on the face of it, should make them other than middle class, nonetheless have adopted major parts of the middle class outlook and seek material success in religion or teaching or science. The middle class outlook, born in the Netherlands and northern Italy and other places in the medieval period, has been passed on by being inoculated to children as the proper attitude for them to emulate. It could pass on from generation to generation and from century to century as long as parents continued to believe it themselves and disciplined their children to accept it. The minority of children who did not accept it were disowned and fell out of the middle classes. What is even more important, they were, until recently, pitied and rejected by their families. In this way, those who accepted the outlook marched on in the steadily swelling ranks of the triumphant middle classes until the 20th century. For more than half a century, from before World War I, the middle class outlook has been under relentless attack, often by its most ardent members, who heedlessly and unknowingly have undermined and destroyed many of the basic social customs that preserved it through earlier generations. Many of these changes occurred from changes in child-rearing practices, and many arose from the very success of the middle-class way of life, which achieved material affluence that tended to weaken the older emphasis on self-discipline, saving, future preference, and the rest of it. One of the chief changes, fundamental to the survival of the middle-class outlook, was a change in our society's basic conception of human nature. This had 2 parts to it. The traditional Christian attitude towards human personality was that human nature was essentially good and that it was formed and modified by social pressures and training. The goodness of human nature was based on the belief that it was a kind of weaker copy of God's nature, lacking many of God's qualities, in degree rather than in kind, but none the less perfectible, and perfectible largely by its own efforts with God's guidance. The Christian view of the universe as a hierarchy of beings, with man about 2/3 of the way up, saw these beings, especially man, as fundamentally free creatures able to move at their own volition towards God or away from Him, and guided or attracted in the correct direction for realization of their potentialities by God's presence at the top of the universe, a presence which, like the North Magnetic Pole, attracted men as compasses upward towards fuller realization and knowledge of God, who was the fulfillment of all good. Thus, the effort came from free men, the guidance came from God's grace, and ultimately the motive power came from God's attractiveness. In this Western point of view, evil and sin were negative qualities. They arose from the absence of good, not from the presence of evil. Thus, sin was the failure to do the right thing, not doing the wrong thing, except indirectly or secondarily. In this view, the devil, Lucifer, was not the epitome of positive wickedness, but was one of the highest of the angels, close to God in his rational nature, who fell because he failed to keep his perspective and believe that he was as good as God. In this Christian outlook, the chief task was to train men so that they would use their intrinsic freedom to do the right thing by following God's guidance. Opposed to this Western view of the world and the nature of man, there was, from the beginning, another opposed view of both, which received its most explicit formulation by the Persian Zoroaster in the 7th century BC, and came into the Western tradition as a minor heretical theme. It came through the Persian influence on the Hebrews, especially during the Babylonian captivity of the Jews in the 6th century BC, and it came in more fully through the Greek rationalist tradition from Pythagoras to Plato. This latter tradition encircled the early Christian religion, giving rise to many of the controversies that were settled in the early church councils and continuing on in the many heresies that extended through the history from Arians to Manichaeans, Luther, Calvin, and the Jainists. The chief avenue by which these ideas, which were constantly rejected by the endless discussions formulating the doctrine of the West, continued to survive through the influence of St. Augustine. From this dissident minority point of view came 17th century Puritanism. The general distinction of this point of view from the Zoroaster to William Golding in Lord of the Flies is that the world and the flesh are positive evils, and that man, in at least this physical part of his nature, is essentially evil. As a consequence, he must be disciplined totally to prevent him from destroying himself and the world. In this view, the devil is a force or being of positive malevolence, and man, by himself, is incapable of any good and is, accordingly, not free. He can be saved in eternity by God's grace alone, and he can get through his temporal world only by being subjected to a regime of total despotism. The direction and nature of the despotism is not regarded as important, since the really important thing is that man's innate destructiveness be controlled. Nothing could be more sharply contrasted than these two points of view, the orthodox and the puritanical. The contrast can be summed up thus. Alright, there's like a chart here on page 1239. They're saying orthodox. Evil is the absence of good. Man is basically good. Man is free. Man can contribute to his salvation by good works. Self-discipline is necessary to guide or direct. Truth is found from experience and revelation, interpreted by tradition. Puritanism is Evil is a positive entity. Man is basically evil. Man is a slave of his nature. Man can be saved only by God. Discipline must be external and total. Truth is found by rational deduction from revelation. The Puritan point of view, which has been struggling to take over Western civilization for its first 1,000 years or more, almost did so in the 17th century. It was represented to varying degrees in the work and agitations of Luther, Calvin, Thomas Hobbes, Cornelius Jansen, Antony Arnauld, Blaise Pascal, and others. In general, this point of view believed that the truth was to be found by rational deduction from a few basic revealed truths in the way that Euclid's geometry and Descartes' analytical geometry were based on rational deduction from a few self-evident axioms. The result was a largely deterministic human situation in sharp contrast with the orthodox point of view, still represented in the Anglican and Roman churches, which saw man as largely free in the universe, whose rules were to be found most readily by tradition and the general consensus. The Puritan point of view tended to support political despotism and to seek a one-class, uniform society, while the older view put much greater emphasis on traditional pluralism and saw society as a unity of diversities. The newer idea led to mercantilism, which regarded political economic life as a struggle to the death in a world where there was not sufficient wealth or space for different groups. To them, wealth was limited to a fixed amount in the world as a whole, and one man's gain was someone else's loss. That meant that the basic struggles of this world were irreconcilable and must be fought to a finish. This was part of the Puritan belief that nature was evil and that a state of nature was a jungle of violent conflicts. Yeah, that's pretty much what Hobbes believed. Some of these ideas changed, others were retained, and a few were rearranged and modified in the following period of the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement, and scientific materialism. All three of these returned to the older idea that man and nature were essentially good, and to this restored belief in the Garden of Eden, they joined a basically optimistic belief in man's ability to deal with his problems and to guide his own destiny. Society and its conventions came to be regarded as evil, and the guidance of tradition was generally rejected by the late Enlightenment and the early Romantics, although the excesses of the French Revolution drove many of the latter Romantics back to rely on history and tradition because of their growing feeling of the inadequacy of human reason. One large change in all three periods was the community of interest, which rejected mercantilism's insistence on limited wealth and the basic incompatibility of interest for the more optimistic belief that all parties could somehow adjust their interest within a community in which all would benefit mutually. The application of Darwinism to human society changed this idea again towards the end of the 19th century and provided the ideological justification for the wars of extermination of Nazism and fascism, and also in the United States. I decided that. Only after the middle of the 20th century did a gradual reappearance of the old Christian ideas of love and charity modify this view, replacing it with the older idea that diverse human interests are basically reconcilable. All this shifting of ideas, many of them unstated or even unconscious assumptions, and the gradual growth of affluence helped to destroy middle-class motivations and values. American society had been largely, but not entirely, middle class. Above the middle class, which dominated the country in the first half of the 20th century, were a small group of aristocrats. Below were the petty bourgeois, who had middle class aspirations but were generally more insecure and often bitter because they did not obtain middle class rewards. Below these two middle classes were two lower classes, the worker and the lumpen proletariat, or so-called or socially disorganized, who had very little in common with each other. Outside this hierarchical structure of five groups and three classes, aristocrat, middle, and lower, were two other groupings that were not really part of the hierarchical structure. On the left were the intellectuals, and on the right were the religious. These held in common the idea that the truth to them was more important than interest, but they differed greatly from the fact that the religious believed that they knew what the truth was, while the intellectuals were still seeking it. This whole arrangement was much more like a planetary arrangement of social economic groupings than it was like the middle class vision of society as a ladder of opportunity. The latter really included only the middle classes with the workers below. The planetary view, becoming increasingly widespread, saw the middle classes in the center with the other five surrounding these. Social movement was possible in a circular as well as in vertical directions, as the older latter view of society believed, so that sons of workers could rise into the middle classes or move right into the religious, left into the intelligentsia, or even fall downward into the declassed dregs. So, too, in theory, the children, or more likely the grandchildren, of the upper middle classes should move upward into aristocracy, which could also be approached from the intellectuals or the religious. Strangely enough, the middle classes had more characteristics in common with each other than they did with the middle classes in their midst. Some, the chief reason for this was that all other groups had value systems different from the middle classes, and above all, placed no emphasis on display of material affluence as proof of social status. From this came a number of somewhat similar qualities and attitudes that often gave the non middle class groups more in common and easier social intercourse than any of them had with the middle classes. For example, all placed much more emphasis on real personal qualities and much less on such things as clothing, residence, academic background, or kind of transportation used, all of which were important in determining middle class reactions to people. In a sense, all were more sincere, personally more secure, not the lumpen proletariat, and less hypocritical than the middle class, and accordingly were much more inclined to judge any new acquaintance on his merits. Moreover, the middle classes, in order to provide their children with middle class advantages, had few children, while the other groups placed little restriction on family size, except for some intellectuals. Thus, aristocrats, religious, workers, the declassed, and many intellectuals had large families, while only the uppermost and most securely established middle class families, as part of the transition to aristocracy, had larger families. Ideas of morality also tended to set the middle classes off from most of the others. The latter tended to regard morality in terms of honest and integrity of character, while the middle classes based it on actions, especially sexual actions. Even the religious based sin to some extent on purpose, attitude, and mental context of the act rather than on the act itself, and did not restrict morality as narrowly to sexual behavior as did the middle classes. However, the middle class influence has been so pervasive in the modern world that many of the other groups fell under its influence to the extent that the word morality by the early 20th century came to mean sex. The Jainist influence on American Roman Catholicism, for example, is so strong that sins concerning sex are widely regarded by Catholics as the worst of sins, in spite of the fact that Catholic doctrine continues to regard pride as the worst sin and sexual sins as much less important, as Dante did. At any rate, sex was generally regarded with greater indulgence by aristocrats, workers, intellectuals, or the declassed than by the middle classes or the more puritanical religious. In America, as elsewhere, aristocracy represents money and position grown old and is organized in terms of families rather than of individuals. Traditionally, it was made up of those whose families had had money, position, and social prestige for so long that they never had to think about these things. Above all, never had to impress any other persons with the fact that they had them. They accepted these attributes of family membership as a right and an obligation. Since they had no idea that these could be lost, they had a basic psychological security similar to that of the religious and workers. Thus, like these other two, they were self assured, natural but distant. Their manners were gracious but impersonal. Their chief characteristic was the assumption that their family position had obligations. This noblesse oblige led them to participate in school sports even if they lacked obvious talent, to serve their university, usually a family tradition, in any helpful way, such as fundraising, to serve their church in a similar way, and to offer their services to their local community, their state, and their country as an obligation. They often scandalized their middle class acquaintances by their unconventionality and their social informality, greeting workers, recent immigrants, or even outcasts by their given names, arriving at evening meetings in tweed or traveling in cheap small cars to formal weddings. The kind of car a person drove was, until very recently, one of the best guides to middle class status, since a car to the middle classes was a status symbol, while to the other classes it was a means of getting somewhere. Oversized Oldsmobiles, Cadillacs, and Lincoln Continentals are still middle class cars, but in recent years, with the weakening of the middle class outlook, almost anyone might be found driving a Volkswagen. Another good evidence of class may be seen in the treatment given to servants, or to those who work in one's home. The lower classes treat these as equals, the middle classes treat them as inferiors, while the aristocrats treat them as equals or even superiors. On the whole, the number of aristocratic families in the United States is very few, with a couple in each of the older states, especially New England, and in the older areas of the South, such as Charleston or Natchez, Mississippi, with the chief concentrations in small towns around Boston and in the Hudson River Valley. Miss Eleanor Roosevelt would be an example. A somewhat larger group of semi aristocrats consists of those like Lodges, Rockefellers, or Kennedys, who are not yet completely aristocratic either because they are not, in generations, far enough removed from money making, or because of the persistence of a commercial or business tradition in the family. But these aristocrats, in the sense that they have accepted a family obligation of service to the community. The significance of this aristocratic tradition may be seen in Massachusetts politics. There, 2 decades ago, the governorship and both senatorial seats were held by a Bradford, a Saltonstall, and a Lodge, while in 1964, two of these positions were held by Endicott Peabody and Leverett Saltonstall. The working class in the United States is much smaller than we might assume, since most American workers are seeking to rise socially, to help their children to rise socially, and are considerably concerned with status symbols. Such people, even if laborers, are not working class, but are rather petty bourgeois. The real working class are rather relaxed, have present rather than future preference, generally worry very little about their status in the eyes of the world, enjoy their ordinary lives, including food, sex, and leisure, and have little desire to change their jobs or positions. They are generally relaxed, have a taste for broad humor, are natural, direct, and friendly, without large, basic insecurities of personality. The world depression, by destroying their jobs and economic security, much reduced this group, which was always proportionately smaller in America, the land of aspiration for everyone, than in Europe. The second most numerous group in the United States is the petty bourgeois, including millions of persons who regard themselves as middle class and are under all the middle class anxieties and pressures, but often earn less money than unionized laborers. As a result of these things, they are often very insecure, envious, filled with hatreds, and are generally the chief recruits for any radical right, fascist, or hate campaigns against any group that is different or which refuses to conform to middle class values. Made up of clerks, shopkeepers, and vast numbers of office workers in business, government, finance, and education. These tend to regard their white collar status as the chief value in life and live in an atmosphere of envy, pettiness, insecurity, and frustration. They form the major portion of the Republican Party's supporters in the towns of America, as they did for the Nazis in Germany 30 years ago. In general, the political alignments in the United States have been influenced even more by these class and psychological considerations than they have been by income, economic, or occupational considerations. The Republican Party has been the party of the middle classes, and the Democratic Party has been the party of the rest. In general, aristocrats have tended to move towards the Democrats, while semi aristocrats often remain Republican with their middle class parents or grandparents, except where historical circumstances, chiefly in New England, the Middle West, and the South, where Civil War memories remained green, operated. This meant that the Republican Party, whose 19th century superiority had been based on the division of the farmers into South and West over the slave issue, became an established majority party in the 20th century, but became once again a minority party because of the disintegration of their middle class support following 1945. Even in the period of middle class dominance, the Republicans had lost control of the federal government because of the narrowly plutocratic control of the party that split it in 1912 and alienated most of the rest of the country in 1932. 20 years later, in 1952, the country looked solidly middle class, but in fact, by that date, middle class morale was almost totally destroyed. The middle classes themselves were in disintegration, and the majority of Americans were becoming less middle class in outlook. This change is one of the most significant transformations of the 20th century. The future of the United States, of a Western civilization, and of the world depends on what kind of outlook replaces the dissolving middle class ideology in the next generation. Transhumanism. The weakening of this middle class ideology was a chief cause of the panic of the middle classes, and especially of the petty bourgeois, in the Eisenhower era. The general himself was repelled by the radical right, whose impetus has been a chief element, but far from the most important element, in his election, although the lower middle class group had preferred Senator Taft as their leader. Eisenhower, however, had been preferred by the Eastern establishment of Old Wall Street, Ivy League, semi-aristocratic Anglophiles whose real strength rested in their control of Eastern financial endowments, operating them from foundations, academic halls, and other tax-exempt refuges. As we have said, this Eastern establishment was really above parties and was much more concerned with politics than with party victories. They had been the dominant element in both parties since 1900 and practiced the political techniques of William C. Whitney and J.P. Morgan. They were, as we have said, Anglophile, cosmopolitan, Ivy League, internationalist, astonishingly liberal, patrons of the arts, and relatively humanitarian. All these things made them anathema to the lower middle classes and petty bourgeois groups, chiefly in small towns and in the Middle West, who supplied the votes in Republican electoral victories but found it so difficult to control nominations, especially in presidential elections, because the big money necessary for nominating in a Republican National Convention was allied to Wall Street and to the Eastern establishment. That's pretty much what's going on now. What the? Where's the post-it notes? Oh. Got a post-it note there. Because that's pretty much what's going on now. It's like people cannot get a representative in office, like a lower middle class person or petty bourgeois. They can't get a person in office that represents them because they don't have enough money to get through the national convention. And of course, you got to get a bunch of people into the electoral college too. Like you got to have a bunch of representatives because the electoral college is more important than the freaking popular vote. The ability of the latter to nominate Eisenhower over Taft in 1952 was a bitter pill to the radical bourgeois and was not coated sufficiently by the naming of Nixon, a man much closer to their hearts, for the vice presidential post. The split between these two wings of the Republican Party and Eisenhower's preference for the upper bourgeois rather than for the petty bourgeois wing paralyzed both of his administrations and was the significant element in Kennedy's narrow victory over Nixon in 1960 and in Johnson's much more decisive victory over Goldwater in 1964. So we can see that these people that are kind of like sponsoring Trump, like a lot of the donors to the Trump ballroom or whatever, I guess they would be categorized as this kind of like upper bourgeois because they're not like full on aristocrats because they still have to like do business. They're still like, even though they're like high level business people, the fact that they still have to like talk to Epstein to like get trades going through or get business deals going through kind of proves that they're not in the like aristocrat level, because the aristocrat levels, like they don't have to work at all. Like everything they do is just voluntary, humanitarian work. So like you can kind of see, and that's the competition, right? It's between the like working class that has these middle class values and then the like upper middle class people that already had these values and are now trying to adopt the aristocratic values and position. And that's kind of like what's been going on in the whole Trump election, the whole Trump, whatever you call it, administration. Kennedy, despite his Irish Catholicism, was an establishment figure. This did not arise from his semi-aristocratic attitudes or his Harvard connections, which were always tenuous since Irish Catholicism is not yet completely acceptable at Harvard. These helped, but John Kennedy's introduction to the establishment arose from his support of Britain in opposition to his father in the critical days at the American Embassy in London in 1938 to 1940. His acceptance into the English establishment opened its American branch as well. The former was indicated by a number of events, such as Sister Kathleen's marriage to the Marquis of Harrington and the shifting of Caroline's nursery school from the White House to the British Embassy after her father's assassination. The ambassador, Ormsby Gore, the fifth Baron Harlech, was the son of an old associate of Lord Milner and Leo Amory when they were the active core of the British American Atlantic establishment. Another indication of this connection was the large number of Oxford-trained men appointed to office by President Kennedy. The period since 1950 has seen the beginnings of a revolutionary change in American politics. This change is not so closely related to the changes in American economic life as it is to the transformation in social life. But without the changes in economic life, the social influences could not have operated. What has been happening has been a disintegration of the middle class and a corresponding increase in the significance by the petty bourgeois at the same time that the economic influence of the older Wall Street financial groups has been weakening and been challenged by new wealth springing up outside the eastern cities, notably in the Southwest and Far West. These new sources of wealth have been based very largely on government action and government spending. But then they'll tell you that you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you get 1 cent of welfare or health care, then you're a complete loser and you should go kill yourself. But all of the popular businesses are funded by the government. Have nonetheless adopted a petty bourgeois outlook rather than the semi-aristocratic outlook that pervades the Eastern establishment. This new wealth, based on petroleum, natural gas, ruthless exploitation of natural resources, the aviation industry, military bases in the South and West, and finally on space with all its attendant activities, has centered in Texas and Southern California. Its existence, for the first time, made it possible for the petty bourgeois outlook to make itself felt in the political nomination process instead of in the unrewarding effort to influence politics by voting for a Republican candidate nominated under Eastern establishment influence. That definitely seems like that's what Trump is. He's a Republican, but he's under the Eastern establishment. That's what it seems like. In these terms, the political struggle in the United States has shifted in 2 ways, or even 3. This struggle, in the minds of the ill-informed, has always been viewed as a struggle between Republicans and Democrats at the ballot box in November. Wall Street, long ago, however, had seen that the real struggle was in nominating conventions and the preceding summer. This realization was forced upon the petty bourgeois supporters of Republican candidates by their antipathy for Willkie, Dewey, Eisenhower, and other Wall Street interventionists, and their inability to nominate their congressional favorites, like Senators Noland, Bricker, and Taft, at National Party conventions. Just as these disgruntled voters reached this conclusion with Taft's failure in 1952, the new wealth appeared in the political picture, sharing the petty bourgeois' suspicion of the East, big cities, Ivy League universities, foreigners, intellectuals, workers, and aristocrats. By the 1964 election, the major political issue in the country was the financial struggle behind the scenes between the old wealth, civilized and cultured in foundations, and the new wealth, virile and uninformed, arising from the flowing profits of government-dependent corporations in the Southwest and West. Okay. We just got to remember that these corporations are government dependent. So when they tell you that you're on welfare or you want to get some health care and that you're a loser, just remember that they get all their money from the government. At issue here was the whole future face of America, for the older wealth stood for values and aims close to the Western traditions of diversity, tolerance, human rights and values, freedom, and the rest of it, while the newer wealth stood for the narrow and fear-racked aims of the petty bourgeois, insecurity and egocentricity. The nominal values between them, such as that between internationalism and unilateral isolationism, which its supporters preferred to rename nationalism, were less fundamental than they seemed, for the real issue was the control of the federal government's tremendous power to influence the future of America by spending of government funds. The petty bourgeois and the new wealth groups wanted to continue that spending into the industrial military complex, such as defense and space, while the older wealth and non bourgeois groups wanted to direct it towards social diversity and social amelioration for the aged and the young, for education and for social outcasts, and for protecting national resources for future use. All right. The outcome of this struggle, which still goes on, is one in which civilized people can afford to be optimistic, for the newer wealth is unbelievably ignorant and misinformed, and their growing concern to control political nominations, they ignored the even greater need to win elections. They did not realize that the disintegration of the middle classes, chiefly from the abandonment of middle class outlook, was creating an American electorate that would never elect any candidate the newer wealth would care to nominate. As part of this lack of vision, the new wealth and its petty bourgeois supporters ignored the well-established principle that a national candidate must have a national appeal, and that this is obtained best by a candidate close to the center. All right, going back to based centrism. I'm gonna stop reading there. Now you can see he's talking about the value structures of the different classes. It doesn't really have anything to do with their actual income, how much money they have. He's like, basically the middle class values are materialism, wealth acquisition, seeking status through objects, materialism, non-clericalism, which basically means like non-religious, or maybe you might be religious but not spiritual. It's like the opposite. People are like, I'm spiritual but not religious, but middle class is religious but not spiritual, right? And it's all based on status. And also they have the psychological problem of, being able to fall into the lower classes at any period in time just by making one wrong business decision or something like that. So they set up a system where it's kind of like the modern Republicans, kind of, but not exactly. And then it explains why all the rich people and the elites or whatever, I don't know, they call them that, all the rich people and the intellectuals and the working class were more Democrat because they shared the outlooks in a certain sense. I don't know. But in any case, you can see how basically the middle class like outlook is what America's outlook is. It's like this materialist, nihilistic, you know, it's only future, they're only looking towards the future for another payoff. It's like, I'm only saving up money so I can buy a bigger car. It's not like they're actually saving up money to like pass it down to their children or to increase the educational status or anything like that outside of the social status of the educational status. Basically, the whole middle class thing is just about social signaling. And now you can see that as the economic ability of people to earn has reduced, you can see why the left wing is so much about virtue signaling now, right? Because they can no longer status symbol through like driving fancy cars and living in nice houses and sending their kids to expensive schools and eating like expensive food and stuff. But they still need to, but now their whole system is just based off of status symbols, right? Their status is based off of status symbols, whereas the older tradition was based off of your personal character, integrity, honesty, hardworkingness, taking care of your family, stuff like that. Now it's just, it went from it being based on social status, based on material items, basically from the end of World War II. And then now, since everything's crashed, now the left is stuck virtue signaling, even though they don't even believe in virtue, because the virtues were the things that the right wing, like Catholics and Orthodox, believe in. That there's a bunch of non-material cultural values, like being a good person, quote unquote, right? And that in and of itself made you a good person, whether or not you were poor or rich or middle class. But the new middle class view was that you were only a good person if you had all of these social status symbols of material wealth, right? Because basically your character was based on how good of a worker you are, how effective your profit making skills were, and then the social status was the material goods that you had. And now, since everyone's losing all their material goods, they've got a virtue signal because they can't status symbol anymore. So it's kind of like transition from material status symbol to virtual symboling of, your virtue or whatever. So it kind of makes sense. And then the whole fact of the war in between the two classes and the Republican Party, the kind of like Eastern establishment, which kind of seems like Trump is part of that. It's like a corporate establishment where all the think tanks and all the roundtable groups are. And then you've got the actual like working class people that aspire to be middle class. And that's kind of like what's going on in the Republican Party right now, especially with like the younger people. It's like they want to maintain those values, but they don't see any avenue to get into the middle class, even though they have middle class values. So I don't know. We're getting close to the end of the book now. So we'll see what he says next tomorrow, hopefully. All right. Thanks for watching the video. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.